Hi, everyone. This is Jason Burack of Wall Street for Main Street and managing editor of The News Doctors and independent financial journalist Eric Dubin. Welcome back to another Welcome to Dystopia podcast. This is episode number 23. Eric, there's so much going on right now with the Brexit, but the gold and silver markets, it seems, we're caught in a trading range, in a holding pattern. It seems, Wall Street is kind of boxing in the gold and silver prices until this Brexit vote is done. Is that how the gold and silver market seems to you?
Yeah, and we, at the same time, see many examples of underlying interest in accumulation. Look at what silver did today. I mean, it's been under pressure periodically all throughout this week and a bit last week, and then all of a sudden through later portion of Asian trading and then through London, we saw silver leap up. It went from about 20 cents to for 1720 to about 1743 or so spot basis, and then London market kept going, and then boom, it was knocked down again. But it's still above the prices that we see prevailing in the last 2 days or so, even though gold has been successfully pushed back down underneath that 1,263 and 80-cent level that I've been talking about periodically on these broadcasts and over on the Silver Doctors as being an important level. That was kind of like a shadow technical kind of signal that the cartel was targeting. It hit that on February 11th on that intraday spike high and then fell back down, and now we're, once again struggling and unable to get and stay above $1,260 gold, never mind get over $1,300. So these are the kind of tape painting, to use the phrase, that's common in Wall Street parlance, that the cartel executes to try to shape sentiment. And, the underlying conditions in the gold market and in silver are very strong. There is a lot of indication that the large buying that's been going on and feeding Asia's appetite over the, last couple of years, and in particular when it stepped up in earnest ever since that huge attack in April of 2013, even though there's been a somewhat curtailment in the purchases from China in the last month and a half or so, the bottom line is that, Wall Street's making up for that. The big investors like the Soroses and Druckenmillers of the world, who, although they're primarily focused on ETF, gold, or in the case of Soros, he's buying a big chunk of Barrick, the largest gold mining company. So in other words, they're not going for physical, but at the same time, it is tightening up the marketplace. And it also empowers, or better said, emboldens the speculators that are going after paper gold on the COMEX and on the LBMA. And that's why we have, had this move for, a lot of fits and starts, but, since basically the end of January onward, we have now been able to test 1,300, and we've failed, but we're going to get over it. Once we get past this Brexit vote, there's a huge amount of attention on Brexit, but the underlying fundamentals behind the rebooting of this precious metals bull market remain, and, it would be nice to see Brexit actually come about and the powers that be not, squelch and manipulate the vote, but I believe that that's going on. And Brexit will probably fail, and it'll be back to business as usual. But this really is just a sideshow. The underlying fundamentals for the precious metals market remain, and we're going to go a heck of a lot higher, even though this has been kind of like an intermission in the last week and a half, 2 weeks, as the perception of the probability of Brexit actually happening was on the rise, and that helped to facilitate more interest in gold. And then just in this last week, we've even seen a lot of people in London lining up and trying to hedge with their own personal pound sterling and exchanging it for euros and dollars and so forth. And there's been an incremental increase in demand for gold as well too, but not as much as people going for paper, which is, it just says a lot about where we are and people's awareness about monetary dynamics and economics.
Yeah, I think George Soros is the type of James Bond villain and scumbag where right now he doesn't manage anyone's money anymore, so he is declaring some holdings and what he bought and things like that, but it's mostly, I think, his own personal money at his family office, which he wasn't happy with the fund managers, the way they were managing, and I think he's gone back into trading. But Eric, I think he's the type of, James Bond villain hypocrite that, he already owns lots of physical gold, at a secure vault. Maybe he's a client of Egon von Greyerz at Matterhorn Asset Management in his super secure gold in the Switzerland mountain. It's not like Egon von Greyerz can say that George Soros is a client. He's not allowed to.
Well, Soros would use a proxy buyer if that was going on anyway. So.
Well, I think Soros is the type where he would own a lot of physical gold and then, totally downplay it. I think that's just the type of person that Soros is. I think a lot of people on Wall Street are like that. But to add to your point, though, about the demand for physical gold, the paper price is having a correction now. I think a lot of it's on Brexit fears. I think it's a lot, the fears are overblown about the paper price. But, there is a story on Zero Hedge this week from Gold Core, C-O-R-E. Marco Byrne over there does a pretty good job covering the gold market. And it's talking about how there's supply issues in the physical gold market for interbank gold. So we are seeing physical supply problems. We are seeing people, boots on the ground lined up to buy physical gold and silver. I've heard of the currency exchange lines for Brexit. I did a video earlier this week about Brexit. If our listeners didn't see that, I think the point to take away, though, is I have no confidence, even if Brexit wins, it's good for the sovereignty of the British people, but I have no confidence in the politicians and bureaucrats and central bankers who would get more power in England to actually do the right thing, to have good monetary and fiscal policies, to stop devaluing the British pound, to do these basic things. We've gotten a lot of comments from people who live in London, are in England on that video, who tell me they want to be entrepreneurs, and the rules and regulations are just not in place there in their country for them to be able to do so. So it's just really sad, because if you go back, Eric, through the history of England, they started the Industrial Revolution. They had an enormous amount of innovation, new products, and things like that. They were one of the main countries basically responsible for even creating the middle class and allowing people to save and get out of poverty and things like that a very, very long time ago. So it's just amazing. I guess this happens, Eric, the arc of empires throughout history. The cycle just turns where the taxes are low to start off with, and there's a lot of innovation, and people can move around and create. And then, people just want to protect the status quo more and more. And I think that's what we have, whether it's in the United States or England. I think, unfortunately, the United States does have a lot of entrepreneurship, but it is headed down that slodgy path of England. There's a lot of blocking of entrepreneurs in so many industries besides the technology industry in the U.S.
There's one other point, too, that's relevant when it comes to Brexit that really doesn't get a lot of airtime, and that's that even if the people in the referendum voted for Brexit, it's not a legally binding referendum. The Parliament in the UK could easily just say, yeah, who cares what you guys think?
That's like a lawyer technicality that they would stick in there, that even if they lost the case, you would still be screwed. It's just unbelievable. They stick these things in there. I was at the gym actually yesterday, and they had on the CNN panel, the hosts were defending Hillary Clinton, and they had experts on there defending Hillary Clinton who had seen the Clinton Foundation, and they were talking about how basically there is not a legal burden of proof to prove that Hillary's corrupt. They're like, how can you say she's corrupt? We haven't gone to court and proven all the evidence and all this stuff. And it's just unbelievable. If there had to be a legal definition of proof for a lot of things in society, nothing would ever get done. So it's just amazing. I guess that's my rant about how, lawyers have stuck in so much stuff into society to slow things down and, gum up the political system, the economy, and things like that. It's just unbelievable, the stipulations and things that lawyers can stick in there and ruin things.
Well, in the politics, the bottom line is that governments and societies always default to the consent of the rule of the governed. And it's pretty darn easy to be really just downright despondent and depressed about the state of our world. And we do, in fact, have so much that is dystopic going on. But the one good thing that we can say about this whole Brexit debate and the whole process by which people in England and beyond their shores are having a discussion about the nature of sovereignty and bureaucracy and local government versus centralized and often completely unaccountable centers of governance that the ECB and the EU represent, and how that influences over England. This kind of stuff is positive to see. It's good to see people debating it. I mean, the awareness and the level at which the discussion is happening, at least in the mainstream, is pretty topical, and they focus on the stuff that really isn't the main concerns that people have, but the discussion is positive, and it's good to see this kind of stuff happening. So,
Amen. And this is why we do the show, Eric. I would rather laugh about things instead of cry. Because, I mean, like, a regular person, a sheeple, I guess we could call them, who didn't understand any of the things we were talking about or we've talked about on past shows, and we try to tell them and lay them out all the things going on, and they would say, well, the world's over, and start crying. Well, you know what? There's different attitudes you can have to view the world through different perspectives, and you can either try to wake other people up or protect yourself and your family and your friends, or you could just feel sorry for yourself and feel depressed. So there's different ways to look at problems in the world.
Yeah.
And I think, laughter is a good way to deal with this. Obviously these problems are serious, but if you laugh about them and try to figure out ways to protect yourself, I think that's better than just sitting around crying, feeling sorry for yourself and feeling depressed.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, so before we talk about any of the other stories going on in the global economy, Wall Street for Main Street now needs less than 100 subscribers from the 10,000 milestone. So if you are not a subscriber to this channel, please subscribe right away, or please refer your friends or family members to this channel. We'd really appreciate getting over 10,000 as soon as possible. It's taken way too many years to do it, but it's been a worthwhile journey. It's been long and difficult, but I wouldn't trade it. Okay, so I wanna get into the stories now. Eric, we have RMB devaluation now. The first RMB devaluation shocked the hedge funds. The hedge funds earlier in the year, about 6 months ago, they were all betting that the RMB would devalue against the dollar. But instead, what the RMB did, what the people in China, the Bank of China, the Chinese central planners did, was devalue the RMB against the Japanese yen and the euro. So that shook out a lot of hedge funds out of the trade. And then, months after that, then they devalued against the dollar. I think that's why we're seeing, strong physical gold and silver demand out of China. And actually, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but actually 50% of the trading volume increases in Bitcoin the last 6 to 8 months has actually been out of China. So there's a lot of prudent, Chinese savers and investors who had cash. They are going into metal and going into Bitcoin because they don't want to just sit there and be sheep to be sheared. They don't want to be devalued without putting up a fight and trying to protect themselves.
Right. And actually, Bitcoin is a pretty decent sentiment gauge on what the average citizen in China is doing, or at least the average middle-class citizen in China. And the whole currency war dynamic and the so-called Shanghai Agreement that was, kind of a loose agreement. I don't even know if I'd even want to use the word agreement, but it was just kind of like a wink and a nod coordination between the Treasury and the central banks of Japan, the United States, and the central bank and the policymakers in China to try to execute a soft, coordinated devaluation of the yuan. But they didn't want to shake up financial markets as aggressively as what happened back in August of 2015 when the Fed was talking about raising interest rates and doing its whole normalization song and dance throughout pretty much all of 2015. China dropped a bomb on the markets by devaluing the yuan vis-a-vis the U.S. dollar, and that sent the S&P 500 down about 10% in 2015, if you'll recall. So, when the whole interest rate normalization quest and propaganda drumbeating was carried over into 2016, the bright stewards of our monetary policy decided, hey, maybe we can figure out a way to reshape the way China is focusing their currency efforts, because they need to devalue to, in their perceived need, boost their export economy. That's part of what they're doing.
This is all based off mercantilism. I mean,
right.
Keynesian economics is based on mercantilism, which is, devaluing currencies to boost exports. Eric, this currency devaluation, it seems like it's a coordinated currency devaluation carousel, and I think I've already thrown up a couple of times. I think the barf bag is full. I'm getting fed up with it, but it seems, these guys just They coordinate it, whether it's the Federal Reserve with the Bank of Japan, the European Central Bank, obviously the Bank of England. The developed economies are coordinating together, and then maybe they let China do it since Chinese goods are important to keep so many people from revolting. Since so many people need, Chinese goods at Walmart and things like that. So maybe they let China temporarily into the club to devalue too. But it's just unbelievable, how these guys are taking turns devaluing the currencies. One country, though, where, the currency has basically collapsed against the U.S. dollar is Brazil. We have the Olympics coming up, but I have two stories from Brazil. They're both really sad, unfortunately. The Brazilian telecom giant, this is from Zero Hedge, Brazil's telecom giant just filed the largest bankruptcy of a private sector company in the nation's history. OISA. If you're Brazilian, you can correct me on the pronunciation if you're a Brazilian listener. That was my best guess. So just under $20 billion bankruptcy in U.S. terms. And then the other major story out of Brazil is that the Brazil state of Rio de Janeiro, which is where a lot of the main Olympic ceremonies are going to be, just got an $850 million bailout weeks before the Olympics from Brazil's federal government. So, Eric, I think, unfortunately, there's going to be fireworks in Brazil, and I'm not talking about the opening ceremony Olympics fireworks. So things are going to be very tumultuous in Brazil come Olympics times. The other stories that are catching my eye in the global economy, did you see, Eric, that TEPCO just admitted the cover-up of Fukushima? So the alternative news media had been talking about this, basically since the day the accident happened. But I think TEPCO finally just came forward and admitted that the problem's way, way worse than they had ever admitted before.
Well, they've been, covering up the whole scandal from day one, and there have been rolling revelations and disclosures coming from TEPCO, kind of like limited hangouts, and I have yet to really dig into what they're talking about now and what they have copped to, but I would be extremely surprised if it's full disclosure. Given the history of TEPCO's tap dancing and obfuscating their responsibility and just outright, trying to cover stuff up, as well, the Japanese government, they literally passed a law making it illegal to criticize the Japanese government, and their control over the media is pretty all-encompassing when it comes to trying to cover up what really went on with TEPCO. I mean, there have been a couple of national-level exposés broadcast in Japan, but we know that, for example, the amount of leaking that has gone into the Pacific Ocean has been extensive, and that TEPCO covered it up.
Yeah, and they also dumped the water that they used to try to cool off the fuel rods. They also dumped it right back into the ocean, which is their food supply, their fish. So I don't think they've actually tested the fish that they're catching and serving, in sushi restaurants and stuff like that there. I think if they did, they would show, the radiation levels of the fish are sky high. So I don't think they want to alarm anyone. I'm pretty sure there's been, individuals or smaller organizations that are not affiliated with the government that have done these tests showing the radiation levels and Geiger counters and things, but the government's not actually doing any of these things. But there are, I have seen articles that there are demonstrations now in Japan. There are people starting to get fed up, which is pretty rare, I think, for Japanese culture, considering how their collectivist culture normally is.
It's exceptional. Yeah, I've been saying that you should not be the nail that stands up and getting hit on the head by a hammer. I completely botched that, but they have a conformity in their society that is probably second to none. And for people to be as upset as they are and standing up and actually demanding that TEPCO fess up to what they've done and actually have a plan to fix the mess is pretty impressive. But all in all, unfortunately, this is something that's been swept under the rug, and to this day, no one really knows, other than people on the inside, what has happened and the degree to which pollution, radioactive cesium and strontium and even plutonium particles were being emitted into the atmosphere when this thing blew. It's scary. And
the Japanese government, Eric, also turned down a lot of help from foreign entrepreneurs, private sector people who had legitimate solutions. I spoke with Riggs Eckleberry, he was running an algae company startup at the time.
Yeah.
It was called Origin Oil, and they sent over a proposal. They were talking about phytoremediation for nuclear radiation, and they're like, we could just grow algae in greenhouses around Fukushima, and, the algae will soak up a lot of the radiation, and in a couple of generations, the algae it will massively reduce the radiation. So they just turned down a lot of these interesting outside-the-box proposals for things like that. And, I think they were talking about an ice wall. I don't know if they actually built it, but this sounds like, out of like one of those Godzilla or Robot Monsters movies, like
right.
Pacific Rim. It sounds like, oh, we'll just build a giant ice wall, right, and that'll stop the problem. I can't believe that, like, that was even a solution. It was, like, just so dumb.
And just to give people context, this ice wall would have been like, 100 feet underground, maybe 10 feet thick. And the idea was that the wall of ice would stop the water going in the water table and then seeping into the Pacific Ocean. So as you can imagine, something that's multiples of a football field in length and this big in terms of its thickness, having to be refrigerated to the point of being frozen underground. I mean,
that sounds like a white elephant project, unbelievably expensive. That sounds like something, Eric, that would cost over $1 trillion. It just sounds like one of these things that one of these ridiculous proposals from a government bureaucrat that, that's the most expensive proposal we can think of. It'll work.
Yeah,
and they don't have like any data to back it up or anything.
And it has to last for 20 generations and then some. It's just nuts. So these are the ideas that TEPCO is coming up with, folks. Real inspiration for confidence in that management team.
Well, I was told phytoremediation, I botched that, works scientifically. So over generations, it actually does work. The plants do. And that's how, they know this from research at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that the plants have helped reduce the radiation levels. Obviously, there's still bad radiation there, but they've drastically reduced them compared to the fallout zones that scientists thought they would be. I think scientists originally, Eric, thought that no one would ever live there again for, thousands and thousands of years at those two cities, that they would be totally uninhabitable. And, I think, the plants, there are plants growing, I think, too, at around Chernobyl. So we are, Mother Nature does figure out a way to solve problems that man does screw up. It's just amazing, though, sometimes about that. I want to transition now to the oil market. We've had this enormous rally in oil, and things do look good on the surface. I've been listening to oil experts and things like that talk about how oil companies can make a lot of money now at $70 a barrel. But I've also seen articles recently, too, about how, even with this oil rebound, how there was a British article, I'll put a link to it in our text box for the show notes, how basically the North Sea has 2 years left of cash on the balance sheet, maybe shares they can raise and credit from all the higher cost North Sea oil producers from all going bankrupt and their production collapsing. So we're still in dire straits in the oil market. It'll be interesting to see if the oil price has a little bit more of a rebound. We've had, a large rebound. I thought we would have one in 2016. It's happened very, very quickly. I think because of how short so many Wall Street traders were in the oil market. Normally, the more people that are short, the faster the recovery is, at least temporarily in a short squeeze. I think that's what we've had in the oil market. I don't think the fundamentals of the market have necessarily justified quite this much of a recovery this quickly. But, we also haven't seen nearly as much production come offline because, Eric, the Saudi Arabia and Russia, they've actually increased production. So we've had a lot of those countries that are not Saudi Arabia and Russia, they've decreased production, but a lot of them are countries like Venezuela and things like that, where there's enormous social problems, and then they don't reinvest any of the oil profits over the decades back into growing oil production or improving their refineries or anything. I think the oil market, though this is just a temporary solution with the oil price going higher, I still think there's a lot more bankruptcies to come.
Oh, definitely. And it can't be understated the degree to which the Avengers in Nigeria and the Canadian fire took a huge amount of barrels per day out of the supply chain. And that, in fact, was a necessary and important catalyst that sparked the short covering rally. So they're linked. And if we look at it from a chronological point of view, the sequence makes sense as well, too. That offtake in the marketplace helped to catalyze the short covering rally. And then on top of that, we probably have, who knows, maybe some more than just the institutional support of, say, for example, some of the local bankers saying to oil companies, yeah, you can deal with your reserves in this way, and we'll be forgiving with loan covenants and so forth for a period of time. There's been an element of that, as well as additional stock offerings and lending to try to keep on life support the more expensive producers in the shale patch. And it's worked. We haven't seen a huge amount of bankruptcies so far, but I don't think that we're going to see a sustained level of oil above 70, for example. Maybe keeping it above 50 and in a range between 50 and 70 for a good chunk of time is doable. And that'll be a level of pricing that will not, trash the entire U.S. shale industry, but it's just going to be kind of like treading water, and we will see more bankruptcies in the future as the economy slows more and as demand declines as a result in the next 12 months.
Yeah, I think in 2015 there was approximately 50 bankruptcies of U.S. shale oil companies in the U.S. Not all of them were shale. Some of them were deepwater offshore. And then in 2016 we've had 65 so far. So compared to all the oil companies out there, that's really not a lot. A lot of the publicly traded ones have survived because they've had access to more debt markets or their credit facilities, or they've been able to sell some assets that are higher cost and raise cash that way. But I think the oil market, for it to get to triple digits again, we need an enormous amount of bankruptcies. So a lot of production comes offline. We've had $200 billion total in capex cuts, which is significant, but we haven't had a lot of the producers producing oil go bust yet. In fact, a lot of the people who are producing oil, like I said earlier, whether it's the shale producers who are producing and trying to delay bankruptcy, or they're in bankruptcy and still producing, and there's still court proceedings going on, or the Russians who have increased to record amounts of oil production, or Saudi Arabia hasn't cut. So there's still a lot of oil producers out there who haven't cut production yet. A lot of the ones who haven't cut production are either trying to use from the lower oil price, they need more revenue. From a lower oil price, they have to produce more to try to pay off creditors, or they're oil is the only revenue source in their country. Mm-hmm. So like Russia, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, they're worried about cutting oil because so much of the country's government's revenue and they're balancing their budget and things like that is dependent on oil revenue. The other thing I wanted to talk about in the oil market, Eric, besides the fact that, if you have good gains in oil, I would take some money off the table here. If you are looking for, there are some bargains in oil, but not as many as there were, 5-6 months ago. I would be more cautious at this point since there's already been a good rebound. I'm not really sure if the oil price can sustain this rally for that much longer, given how the global economy is in peril right now. But for triple-digit oil, for us to see that, we would need to see drastically devalued currencies, the dollar maybe lose the petrodollar, and also a lot of the producers go bankrupt. The other thing I wanted to talk about in the oil market, Eric, was the zero hedge story, quoting OPEC people, that they were talking about production in Venezuela and the problems in Venezuela with the hyperinflation and society problems, how talking about a regime change in their political, in their government. So it's interesting that OPEC is commenting on this. You had some interesting stuff before we started recording about OPEC, though. Yeah,
the reality is that Venezuela is the only OPEC country in the Western Hemisphere, and for the most part, the balance of OPEC really couldn't give a rat's rear end about what happens to Venezuela, and it's in their economic interest in terms of the cartel to see lower output from Venezuela, because as a cartel, the goal is to constrain output to keep prices high. That's the point of a cartel. And OPEC's interests are actually served by seeing Venezuela suffer. So, when you relayed that story, the internal inconsistencies in terms of the power dynamics and the logic behind what the power players are doing in OPEC just kind of stick out like a sore thumb. It's very clear. There is an element in terms of the domestic politics in Venezuela that's influenced by external forces that want to basically overthrow the Bolivarian revolution. And we've talked about this before. I mean, the Bolivarian revolution and socialism is by no means a good way of organizing a society, but it didn't come out of a vacuum. It came out of the corruption and instabilities and inequalities of Venezuela as part of the Anglo-American Empire, for lack of a better way of putting it. And right now, there's hopefully going to be some kind of evolution in Latin America where there is a rise of a third way that incorporates libertarianism and Austrian school economic perspectives and more of a understanding of true free enterprise that's not dominated by a power elite that basically is grafted onto the country that services the interests of a much bigger order internationally. And
in Brazil there is. I'm not sure about the other Latin American countries, but I know Brazil there is. There's been stories on it on libertarian websites. And also ESPN even had a story about it last year when they were previewing they had done a review of the World Cup in Brazil and also previewing the Olympics. They were talking about the anarchists and capitalists in Brazil that are emerging on the streets protesting it.
Yeah.
So I think they have, on a percentage basis, obviously there's more people converting to libertarian in the United States right now, but on a percentage basis, their growth, I think the libertarian movement is growing fastest actually in Brazil than pretty much anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, and there's pretty decent seeds of the movement in Argentina and even in Colombia, and surprise, surprise, there's a small libertarian movement in Venezuela. So.
Well, the funny thing is, Eric, there's actually a lot of people in many different countries in the developing world that actually hate their government. They don't like paying taxes. They hate paying taxes. They avoid paying taxes and things like that. So they have a lot of libertarian tendencies. They're not called libertarian necessarily, right, but they have a lot of things in agreement with the libertarian. And they're not white people. I've heard there was this one. It's a funny story. There was this one libertarian girl. I think she calls herself a reformed libertarian now. She's no longer a libertarian, and she was talking about how libertarians are all white privileged white guys from the U.S., which is not true. But it's just ridiculous that, like the feminazis are just labeling that stuff, not knowing how the rest of the world, people honestly don't want government involved with a lot of their different stuff, and they don't want to pay taxes and things like that. Stuff that makes a lot of sense to people is libertarian philosophy. And, it's not something that a bunch of white guys developed here in the United States. It's basically a lot of it just common sense that, they want to be left alone. They don't want government telling them everything to do. And, they want low taxes and things like that. Okay, well, before we get to our scumbag nominee section, and Eric has a special one, he actually has a scumbag cleaner.
An antidote to scumbag.
Scumbag cleaner sounds funnier than scumbag antidote, but yeah, I mean, guys, like I did a video last weekend. I talked about, the global economy is just one giant global clusterclock, and I talked about a number of the news stories going on in so many different countries. A lot of you guys out there, before you woke up, maybe your friends and family members, they only pay attention to things in their local economy, or maybe they read the newspaper for their own country. They don't understand how bad things are on a global basis. So wake your people up, wake the people you care about up, and let them know that there's a lot of problems in the global economy. So when you hear, these jobs reports in your country, or there's no inflation, or the GDP is growing, you should be very skeptical of the government numbers in pretty much every single country nowadays. Okay, so let's get to the scumbag nominees. Eric, we're only at 33 minutes. We're doing a good job. we're
going to keep it under an hour.
Yes. So we're at the scumbag nominee section. My first scumbag nominee, I actually just read the biography on him last weekend. It's Elon Musk. Now, I think he has a lot of chutzpah. I think he's, a ballsy entrepreneur. I think also, Eric, unfortunately, I think he's a corrupt crony capitalist. And I don't think he's that nice a guy to a lot of different people. Did you see the story about Solar City? After reading the book and finding out the story of Solar City, it basically looks like now that Tesla, or basically Elon Musk, since he basically is Tesla, is going to bail out Solar City with shareholder capital. So Solar City is a large solar company, and they're, I think, hemorrhaging $700 million a month in debt and other cash flow burn problems to pay debt and cash flow burn, and they're not doing as well as they were a couple of years ago. And, one thing is, if Elon was writing a check out of his own money to help his family members out, that's fine. No problem with that. That would be great, good person, right? No problem with that. But what he's doing now is he's destroying, corporate governance. And he basically, without shareholder approval, he's giving away around $3 billion worth of Tesla stock to bail out his cousins. So because his cousins put all of their money into Solar City to start up the company, I think around 2006. So this has a lot of disconcerting things there if you're a Tesla shareholder. If you like free markets in general, it's very suspicious there about what's going on.
Do you remember how much of a percentage Musk holds of Tesla? I don't recall.
They've been doing so many share issuances. They've actually been issuing an enormous amount of stock. In May, they issued $2 billion worth of stock, and he actually promised in February of this year, I was reading articles on Tesla more about this Solar City deal. Elon Musk actually promised in February 2016 that they wouldn't do any more dilution because they had already raised $5 billion to build out the Gigafactory, which is going to be the world's largest, lithium-ion batteries. But the cover story though for this buyout for Solar City is he's saying, there's synergy in the deal.
Right.
We need the solar, not the solar cells, the lithium-ion power cells that go in people's houses. That Solar City is selling those. So there are retail sales of those Tesla units, and we're going to put solar panels at the charging stations for Tesla supercharging stations for the cars. So there's going to be all these synergies there. But I just don't see that. I think, this is really just a bailout. And I've talked with, I'm going to have on tomorrow, Kevin Duffy, Austrian School hedge fund manager, short selling extraordinaire. The guy he follows the most is Jim Chanos, the short seller. Jim Chanos, the hedge fund manager. Chanos called this Tesla deal the worst example of corporate governance, one of the worst examples of corporate governance in the history of the United States.
Well, I don't know if I'd go that far, but it is certainly very stinky. I mean, the synergies and the whole thesis behind that is real. The trouble is that we're talking about an industry that has a timeline unfolding over 2 decades, and the only reason why Tesla and Solar City in particular got as big as it did was because of the crony capitalism that's enveloped it and the kind of subsidies that have been dumped into the entire solar industry in the United States that was the fertile ground upon which Solar City was allowed to initially explode from out of nowhere. So you end up getting this completely unstable, malinvestment-filled industry that requires bailouts, even though the fundamental service that they're providing can theoretically at some point, maybe reach grid parity as it is discussed in terms of the cost per kilowatt hour. But it's going to take a long time to get there. So what happens is we get all this crazy malinvestment, non-capitalist market operations going. And Musk is like a crony capitalist extraordinaire. And so, he qualifies as a scumbag for that reason alone.
Yeah, and if I could add to your points there, Eric, the Chinese are also subsidizing solar panel manufacturers too. They flooded the market, so they were subsidizing the manufacture of solar panels. This goes back to me saying that all the energy markets are not free markets in general. I've said this many times.
3 years ago, Germany was subsidizing the equivalent of, 80% of all installations were coming out of the taxpayers in Germany. I mean, you can't build a capitalist marketplace when 80% of the funding for that marketplace is being provided as a subsidy because the marketplace doesn't work without the subsidy.
Yep. I've heard from clean technology people that oil's gotten tax breaks and subsidies for over 100 years. That's their counter excuse. Yeah. But no one should get a subsidy. That's the bottom line. No one should get tax credits. No one should get subsidy. There just shouldn't be high taxes and government bureaucracy, giving out these billion-dollar projects and all this. We don't need any more Fiskars or Solyndras or anything like that. But this is what happens with a lot of these crony capitalists. I think there was 50 CEOs recently that just endorsed Hillary Clinton. I just saw a new story on that flash today. So there's 50 prominent CEOs and technology CEOs and other ones in the United States endorsing Hillary Clinton, despite all the evidence out there showing that you shouldn't endorse Hillary Clinton. So welcome to Dystopia, guys. It's just unbelievable, though, that I guess when you're a technology CEO and you have a cool, hot new product, by the way, Tesla's not even consistently making money. They've made a profit here or there, but it seems like their expenses grow as fast as their revenue does. So it's like, I guess as long as the stock price is higher, he can keep selling more shares to keep that game going. But I don't know, if they don't execute right, everything's going to collapse and fall to tears.
Yeah, I almost feel like I hear Obama's "you didn't build that" echo in my mind. When you consider the subsidies that have, a broad impact on the economy in terms of supporting the alternative energy industry across the board, and how that filters through to Tesla and to solar.
Yep. And speaking of Obama and subsidies, have you heard of the guy Van Jones? He's on like CNN. He was
yeah, I actually know Van Jones.
Yeah, I think he was actually a hardcore communist.
He was, and then
he was really radical.
He remains. He hides it. I spent 21 years in the Bay Area, and have had an opportunity to interact with him a couple of times.
Oh, that's interesting. He actually got money to build a solar company, and he was making really big bucks for a while. Yeah. I don't know if it went bankrupt or what, but, I guess he was one of these hypocrite Marxists or whatever. The fascism is something like Obama has been hiding his communist streaks tendencies too. I didn't say it properly right in past interviews over the years, but I think fascism is a compromise that a lot of these communists and Marxists have settled for. So we have guys like Obama, making all these money off book deals once he leaves the presidency and other things, and then we have guys like Van Jones who are hardcore communists or Marxists, and they're getting money kickbacks to start solar companies, and people are calling them great capitalists. Well, you know what? He got all these insider crony contracts that he never would have gotten without his crony connections.
Well, there's the personal ideology level in each person, and then there's what they do in terms of their day-to-day lives. Van Jones believes in a Marxist frame of reference and worldview. There's just no two ways about it. But he governs his business activities as a crony capitalist.
Yeah, I view those people as hypocrites, but I guess, their justification is, like you said, they can separate those things, but I view people who separate like that as total hypocrites.
Yeah.
That's just, I don't view them as authentic people then. I view that as, they're hiding their true self. Anyways, though, our other scumbag nominees, we have George Soros and I forget which Rothschild for their Brexit comments, talking about, trying to scare people to vote against Brexit, which is just ridiculous. I mean, George Soros, given his history with England and breaking the pound and, all his other problems and starting color revolutions, I don't know why anyone listens to him anymore.
Because he's got money.
A lot of ill-gotten gains in crony capitalism. Okay, and the other nominee, the other scumbag nominee I have is Jean-Claude Juncker. He's the European Council president, and he was talking about the Brexit vote and how if people don't agree with him, they can basically go F themselves, and if they agree with him, then they're smart people and all this. So he was talking. I think this guy has a god complex. This seems pretty common though for the the bureaucrats in the United States and in Brussels. These bureaucrat guys, they have master's degrees or PhDs, and they have jobs that they can't get fired from normally. So a lot of these guys have attitudes like this, Eric, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and my final story, I'm not sure actually who to nominate for this, but the news story, I think it's the European Union if they're going to actually go through with this. It's that robots, they're debating now to give robots electronic persons rights. And we don't even have artificial intelligence yet, but we're already having European Union bureaucrats in Brussels, I guess, debate whether or not to already start giving robots rights.
Yeah, it's progressivism and proactively dealing with the eventual reality of robots having feelings. You got to make sure that we don't hurt their feelings. We've got to make sure they have their rights protected.
Yeah. Meanwhile, the constitutions that are in place for regular humans, they're not sticking to the constitutions, and they're taking away people's rights.
At least robots don't have to go to the bathroom, and we won't have this big scandal about changing. We won't need a fourth version of a bathroom. Transgendered, male and female, and robot.
Or maybe it's steampunk, where there's like half cyborg. It's half robot, half human. Then I don't know, but yeah, I mean, who knows? Maybe they will make it so robots have to go to the bathroom so they can get some WD-40 or some oil.
Yeah.
so they can get some they're leaking WD-40 or leaking oil or something like that, and then the robots are programmed to say, oops, I went to the bathroom.
Well, before we fall further into the gutter, this time around I was bringing to our show somebody who is hopefully going to retire one of our previous and perennial scumbag nominees, and that is Senator John McCain. And Kelly Ward is a state senator in Arizona who's contesting his seat, and the primary is August 30th. And yesterday she published a video that flat out outed Cain and his role in funding terrorists in a Syrian war theater. It's pretty explosive in the sense that this woman has guts. I'm very impressed with the fact that she is able and willing to come out and spotlight the fact that McCain has in fact been a steward of empire. He's been probably the most important person, second only to two people actually. John McCain is second only to Hillary Clinton and John Kerry in terms of the people who orchestrated what happened first in Libya and the whole Benghazi affair, and how the weapons and personnel went into Syria thereafter, and also how in Al-Qaeda in Iraq's demise and rebirthing into the forces that became the Al-Nusra Front, which is essentially Al-Qaeda in Syria. We have been supporting these groups in an effort to overthrow Assad, the president, the duly elected president of Syria, and basically have created conditions along with our allies in Turkey, in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, other Gulf nations, the United Kingdom, and Israel, have created conditions that basically have given birth to this so-called civil war in Syria that has killed more than 250,000 people and has put more than 1 million people on the run, and refugees that are flooding Europe and now beginning to come into the United States as well. And a certain percentage of these people, maybe only 0.5%, 1 out of every 200 or whatever that could conceivably have terrorist leanings or whatever, but we're talking about tens of thousands of people that are going to be coming into the United States. And in the vast majority, if not all other previous wars, it was standard policy to have refugee camp settlements and processing centers and so forth established within the actual war theater. It makes no sense to spend 5-10 times as much money to rehouse people in the United States, in Europe. This policy of rehousing is being done by design. It's counterproductive. It does not serve the interests of the people as well that are running from the war theater. So all of this is basically prima facie evidence of the whole Hegelian dialectic of benefiting from a crisis, the problem, reaction, solution scenario, and George Soros has been a key player in this as well, too, in terms of facilitating it. So anyway, it's encouraging to see that people in Arizona are waking up, and people around the country also aware of this race as well, too, because John McCain has been such an important person when it comes to facilitating the actors on the ground that have put together ISIS, that have put together the Al-Nusra Front. This guy has been involved with that stuff. He is the penultimate scumbag, and I'm happy to say that there's a very slim possibility, but a possibility nonetheless, that he may be retired, and that Kelly Ward, state senator in Arizona, may in fact be the next Arizona United States senator, and that would be pretty cool to see. So we'll put a link in to an article I wrote about the video that Kelly Ward released yesterday. I think that everyone should check it out. It's pretty impressive that somebody would dare to say these kind of things on the political front. And the Republican Party is kind of a basket case. It has a huge amount of internal divisions, and it's certainly not a party that stands for libertarian values and sound money and so forth across the board. And it certainly does not champion liberty, and it certainly does not champion a sound foreign policy that actually would procure true national security for the United States because it's in the pocket of this kind of globalist enterprise that crosses both the Republican and Democratic parties. And, you know, we're kind of like a captured nation in terms of our the special interest governing our policy that basically screws the average American. And, you know, the two-party system is broken. But every once in a while, there are interesting people that bubble up through the system. Kelly Ward, state senator in Arizona, is definitely one of them. So we'll include a link on that, and I encourage every one of our listeners to go and check out the article I wrote in the video that she produced. It's only about 3 minutes long, but it truly is surprising to see a candidate for the United States senator flat out, you know, one of the strongest neocon incumbents in the United States Senate. It's refreshing to see, and we bring you a lot of depressing crap every week or every other week when we produce Welcome to Dystopia, and in particular the scumbags that we feature. So a scumbag cleaner is my nomination for this week. Kelly Ward.
Yeah, it's really amazing what can be accomplished with social media now. You go back and show just how bad of a hypocrite someone was, or a total, you know, scumbag or a-hole, the bad things they did, or they're pretending that they didn't do them, or things like that. I mean, I remember 3 or 4 years ago seeing on Twitter and other places on the internet, I think Michael Krieger of Liberty Blitzkrieg, he had photos of John McCain taken, I think he was either in Libya or Syria, and he was taken with, you know, ISIS fighters and Al-Qaeda over there, calling them freedom fighters. So,
yeah, those were photos that were captured in Libya when John McCain was organizing the folks that were taking the arms that, you know, were liberated in the process of the whole Benghazi scandal. I mean, Benghazi and that scandal happened because the embassy was being used to facilitate the rat line of arms and personnel into Syria to set up the conditions to overthrow the Assad government using terrorism as a tool. And the reason why Benghazi went down the way that it did is because if the United States intervened, it could have very conceivably blown that whole operation.
Yeah, if I could add, you know, it's good that John McCain's being totally exposed for being a hypocrite and a liar and a fraud. But unfortunately, though, I think, Eric, I don't know if you noticed this, but his daughter, who's a pretty attractive blonde, is actually being groomed, it looks like, you know, to take over 5 or 10 years down the line to take her father's place as a figurehead in the Republican Party as another neocon and stuff. So they've like she has a huge Twitter profile, you know, she's making media appearances now, she's commenting on Fox News on issues, so they're grooming her to replace her dad.
And let's hope that Kelly Ward puts a spanner in that mix.
Okay, well, that's the show for today, guys. We're actually under an hour by about 7 minutes. Yes! So I want to thank everyone for listening to this, and we do need less than 100 subscribers for 10,000 on our YouTube channel. Thank you guys a lot, and we're going to keep cranking out good shows like this one again in the next couple weeks.